Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this week's Agile London. Great to see some of you return and some new faces as well. Just a couple of just very brief house rules, if I may. Please can you all remain on mute throughout the whole session because for obvious reasons, really, I want to provide the best platform possible for our speakers and the best platform possible for all of you lot in the audience to be able to fully listen as well. I really welcome and all our speakers previously, and I'm sure tonight's no different, very much welcome questions. So please do get your questions into me. But if I may ask, if you could just get them into me via the chat at the bottom of your screen, send them to me privately, and please be very clear on who you would like me to ask the question to. I do it this way so everyone can clearly hear the question being asked and the answers from our speakers. So, really looking forward to this one tonight. We've got two great speakers, Emma Hopkinson-Spark, who is Chief of Staff at 101 Ways and a specialist in coaching and transformation, and Amanda Colpoys, who is a business agility coach at OVO. Now, Emma's kicking us off and starting off tonight. Her talk is delivery styles. So Emma, over to you.
Cool. If you do hear some strange noises, by the way, the aircon in my office keeps buzzing every now and then, so apologies. There's nothing dodgy that's going on. It's my husband says it's condensation on the pipes or something, who knows. Right, so let me share my screen and you can see my presentation. Cool. Right, so yes, I am Emma. I'm Chief of Staff at 101 Ways. And we are a consultancy business that spend our time helping technology leaders solve some of their more complex challenges. And I myself am the director that is responsible for leading, as I said, the coaching and transformation side of the business. So I tend to spend my time mostly with the exec and teams, helping them figure out what their organizational culture is actually like, where they want it to be, and the kind of steps and things that they can do to try and influence change in their organization. So the thing that I'm going to talk to you today is about delivery styles. And this really came from a conversation with a friend and colleague years and years ago when we were faced with a particularly difficult client, I should say, that really some of the challenges that we faced in that was we boiled it down to the fact that when they said Agile, it meant something very different to what we had in our heads as Agile. And so we did some whiteboarding and did lots of conversation and lots of exploring in that. And what we came up with is effectively 4 styles of delivering work and ways of working, all of which people tend to use, or most of which people tend to use under this banner of Agile. And really, it was that disparity between our vision of what Agile was and the client's vision of what it was that was where a lot of our frustration and our challenges came with them. So what I'm going to do is talk you through those 4 different styles. And really over the years, it's worth saying this has kind of evolved to a point where it almost becomes the blueprint or the template for how I tend to go into organizations to start with and really understand where they're at, where they think they're at, and where they want to be or need to be, what's holding them back from moving forwards, and really try and see where they are on that spectrum of Agile ways of working. So if I skip through, 1 sec. Right, so first of all, what I'm going to show you is, this is what we call, it's affectionately known as the people that have seen it as my loopy diagram. Now, that could be because it's full of loops, or it could be because they think I'm particularly loopy when I start to draw it for them. But either way, down the left, what you're going to see is 4 very broad areas that you would go through when you try and deliver a new product or a new thing into out to customers. Now, don't get too hung up on what these things are. They're very broad brush so that it can encompass all the different ways. But basically, if we start with ideation, so at some point, you're going to have to think of a thing that you want to do. Maybe it's a wholly formed product vision that you've gone and got a business case signed off for. Maybe it's an idea on a whiteboard. It's a hypothesis that you want to test. But at some point, you're going to have an idea for something and have to get buy-in from the people around you that this is a good thing to go and do, that this is something that you want to go and do. the next thing you may want to end up doing is some kind of planning. Now, it doesn't have to be massive planning. Maybe it's just, okay, we've got this idea. Now, how are we going to make that real? So whatever the style it is that you're actually working through, it's still going to have an idea, and then you're going to have to plan some way of actually implementing it. And along with that comes the detail. Actually, how do we do that then? What is the implementation of this? What are the steps that we need to take to actually make this real? What are the challenges? What are the pitfalls? How do we make this thing actually live and breathe and get this out to people? And then delivery. And this is a really broad, when I say delivery, I mean development, I mean test, I mean out to live. This is your Nike moment, the doing bit, okay? You might want to break those down into 50 different areas if you could, or maybe in some cases it's only one. But whatever it is you're trying to do, I want to implant the idea that at some point you're going to run through these 4. Okay, so this is where we'll move on to the 4 and where it might get a little bit controversial, seeing as this is an Agile meetup. But the first one I'm going to talk about is what we call a sequential delivery. Notably, I don't call it waterfall. Now, Ewan and I, when we first started talking about this years ago, we made a really conscious decision not to label this waterfall, because it was basically a joke, right? It's an insult. It's meant for you to envisage that cliff edge where everything falls off. But the reality is there's an awful lot of people and organizations that are still delivering their products, their projects, their work in this way. But the characteristic that's common to it is that this is a one-way street, okay? You get one shot at each of these. Now, in reality, I have seen organizations spend months in that first stage, getting a business case approved and drawing out what they think this product can be and getting approval before moving on, budgetary approval before they move on to any kind of planning. They'll then spend months perhaps in that planning stage where what they come out of it is a massive project plan. And I've seen hundreds and hundreds of lines on Gantt charts, I'm sorry to say, of what that planning might be, that comes up with a hard deadline of when this thing is going to go live. And I know most people are on mute and off screen now, balking at the idea of it. And then the detail, there was one client in particular, they had spent literally 6 months with teams of business analysts prepping loads and loads of use cases and requirements documentation before it was then passed on to a team of solution architects who are designing high-level technical specs to be passed on to tech lead teams that do the low-level tech specs and break it down into tasks that developers can then go and do, only for a year later for it to go into 3 months of UAT before they even get a sniff of live. That's the reality of it. And I'm trying really hard not to sound judgmental, but the reality is that, say, lots of organizations are still working in this way. And the characteristic is that it is one-way street. Really, even in those teams and in the client I'm thinking of particularly, in development, there were plenty of people I was working with in that particular team that are who I would describe as agile people. They get it, they want to work well, they are collaborative in their approach, they're doing awesome pair programming, they're as collaborative as they can with the business, but they're working within the constraints of their organization, and their sphere of influence and their little bubble is so small that they can't break out of that development environment that they're in and influence the product at all. So that is the characteristic of a sequential delivery. Okay, the next one I want to talk a little bit about is incremental. And here you can start to see why people call this my loopy diagram. Because what we have is a little loop that comes back up into the detail. Generally speaking, organizations that are working in this way are doing Scrum, actually. And what they've done, though, is take their big product idea that they've had sign off for and they have their massive plan for. And what they've done is they've chunked it up into loads of little bits that they're going to go and then deliver in increments. And what they're doing is maybe getting some stuff ready just in time for the next sprint, but nothing they do is going to influence the planning of what they do next, or the timescales, or the product itself. The success or failure, certainly in the sequential side of it, their success is judged by how well they stick to that plan and how well they meet the original objectives from their business case. In an incremental delivery, the same is still true, actually. If the minute a team starts to drop the pace slightly and their plan looks like it's in jeopardy and they're not going to hit the timescales that they thought they would or deliver on some of those objectives, that's when they'll start to call into question how well this is working. Usually Scrum gets the blame at that point, and they call in someone like a new Scrum Master or an Agile coach to come and help fix the team because they're not delivering the way that they should be. Really, what they've done is take one massive delivery and chunk it up into bits and then expect that to run through and call it Scrum. Really sounding judgmental, and I'm not trying to be, I promise. The next then is another loop, a bigger loop. This is iterative delivery. So here what you can see is that loop going slightly higher in what you're trying to do, and this is where teams generally have an opportunity to influence certainly the planning and the refinement of what it is they're doing. So this is where maybe they have actually got to live at the end of delivering something that they're doing every sprint or every increment or whatever it is, every iteration that they're doing. But what they're doing is using what they've learned to influence maybe the prioritization of what comes next, or the size of the work that they think it is, so thereby refining some of the features or the details that's going to get released. But what they're not doing is influencing still what the product is. At its core, it's still the thing that they said they would do in the first place, trying to stick to a plan, but taking some of that learning and allowing that to influence what they're going to do next. Most companies that I see, actually, certainly from a transformation perspective, are somewhere between incremental and iterative. That's worth saying. Okay. The next then, and the last on the list, is adaptive. Now this is where you genuinely get to influence what the product is. And rather depressingly, perhaps, I'm sorry to say, of all the companies that I've worked with over the last 10, 15 years or so, I've only met one actually that I would describe as truly embracing that adaptive way of working, and they were very small. And what they were doing was genuinely, hey, I've got an idea for a product, show it to some users in the smallest possible way we can. Oh, that's interesting. They haven't used it at all how I thought they would use it. And actually the need that the customer has isn't the need that I thought they had. Let's change the product completely and go in a different direction. And that's only really happened once. I think it's also fair as an observation to say that there is a correlation between the left to the right of this diagram and the size of the organization that I've tended to work with. I'm hoping that it's more of a sign of, because I'm working particularly in coaching and transformation, that maybe I've just had the gnarly ones and that there are more organizations that are further to the right. But in reality, I would say I've only seen it once, that people are actually working in that way. I've rattled through those, but what I want to do is, now we've got all four on screen and you can see them all, I'm going to say something quite controversial. I probably have already. But how to say this nicely? I see an awful lot of almost snobbery in the Agile community, in the Agile world, and the people that we talk to, where I hear an awful lot of, this company's Agile or it's not, this person's Agile or they're not. And I really don't think that talking about it in those kinds of ways is helpful. You know, we've all been frustrated working in an organization thinking this place isn't Agile, and they say they are and they're not. But actually, if you think of it less as they are or they aren't, this isn't black and white, it's not binary. This is about a whole spectrum of different ways of working. And actually, if you can just get an organization to be honest, eyes open, where are we? You know, actually, if we say we're Agile, what does that mean to us? That's when you can start to have some real useful discussions about where you want to be and how you want to get there, instead of just putting it into those definite terms of we're Agile or we're not. This person is Agile or they're not. They get it or they don't. I think it also leads into a question of some employee satisfaction. There's an awful lot of us, I say, have been frustrated. And if you are, think of it this way, if you are somebody that really wants to and sees yourself as being completely adaptive in the way that you want to work, and you're in an organization that is stuck somewhere between incremental and iterative, then of course you're going to get frustrated. And of course you're going to get disgruntled. And that's where you tend to see dysfunction start to manifest in the teams. And that's when you start to see problems in the culture in the organization, which is probably why I see a lot of it, because that's when I tend to get brought in to try and help with some of those situations. So if there's a challenge that I want to give you as an audience as I try and wrap up, and this isn't a particularly long talk, so we have lots of time back for the next one, Amanda. The challenge to you really is to look at the organization that you're in, and given this scale, this sliding scale, and by all means you can steal the slide and have it when you think about it later on, where would your organization say that they are right now? Where would they imagine that they are? And then given some of the characteristics that they see, are they able to deliver into live every time you've done something? Is it a one-way street? How big is that sphere of influence, that bubble that you can actually get some change and get some influence into what comes next? Given the characteristics that you see, where are they really? So where do they think they are? Where are they really? And then actually, why are they there? What's holding them back? Do they want to be further to the right than they really are? Are they comfortable? And it serves them very well working the way that they are doing. But what are the organizational constraints that they're working within that means that's where they are right now? And if they do want to be in a different model or in a different style, then what are the things that you can do? What are the steps that you can do to try and change some of that? It doesn't have to be revolutionary. What we're talking about is evolution over revolution. You don't have to go all or nothing. To make that leap from sequential all the way to adaptive is huge. And I wouldn't ask any organization to even try and do that. I've seen plenty of teams and organizations practically implode at trying to do too much all at once. But by being really realistic and honest about where you are and where you want to be, that's when you can start to make some genuine change and influence about moving from one style to another. Okay, and I think that was everything I wanted to say. Yes, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I would take questions, but I think we're all going to do questions at the end. So I think that was everything I wanted to say on that. Okay.
Emma, thank you very much. Fantastic talk. And yes, questions at the end. I've had a few come in, which is great. Thank you everyone for those. So I will ask them to you at the end. Okay, Amanda, do you want to just check your screen share is all okay? So Amanda is a business agility coach at OVO, and her talk is, we need to talk about autonomy. It's more complicated than we thought. Amanda, over to you.
Great, thanks, Alex. Thanks to everybody that's here. Obviously, beautiful evening outside, so really appreciate you coming indoors from the sunshine to listen to Agile talks. Try and make this not too long so you can get some of your evening back. So yeah, as Alex said, my talk is all about autonomy. When I started my Agile career, like a lot of people, the first step that I took was to do a Scrum Master training course. And on this course, we were all told, never tell the team what to do. Looking back, I think this advice was not very helpful because it was very simplistic. Another thing that we did on that course, we were asked as a group to organize ourselves into a row based on how long we'd worked in technology. So people that were just starting in technology at one end and people that had been in technology the longest at the other end. And the point of the exercise was to demonstrate the concept of self-organization, which it did. Unfortunately, the exercise also implied that self-organization is literally that simple, that you just give people autonomy, you stop telling them what to do, and overnight self-organization will miraculously happen and it'll all be hunky-dory. And I think the reality of that is not true. Agile totally depends on autonomy. It's a founding principle. You basically cannot be fully agile. I think Emma made an excellent point in her talk that it's on a scale. If you want to get right to the right hand end of Emma's diagram successfully, you need autonomy. So if we don't make autonomy work, we're going to struggle with agility. So I want to talk this evening a little bit about how I've got to my sort of current thinking and some of the experiences that have formed my view, and suggest why we might want to start thinking about autonomy and talking about it a little bit differently. In case I say anything controversial this evening and you start to wonder if I really believe in autonomy, I thought it might be worth just kicking off with, why does it matter? So autonomy matters because it helps us be better, faster, and happier, essentially. Autonomy enables us to come up with better outcomes because teams are closer to problems, they have better context, so they tend to come up with better solutions and create more impact. We get more speed because we don't have to keep referring decisions back to management, so we're liberated to move faster. And we get intrinsic motivation when people have ownership of a problem, they have a greater sense of commitment towards it, and they also find that work becomes its own reward. The enjoyment of solving the problem is rewarding in itself. So whatever I might say this evening, whatever you might think, I'm wholeheartedly believe in autonomy. It's really important, and it's because I think it's really important that I think we need to get better at it. We need to improve the success rate of autonomy, really. So I think when we're talking about autonomy, the first thing that we need to recognize and communicate is that autonomy itself is not actually autonomous. In order for autonomy to happen successfully, certain prerequisites need to be in place. It depends on certain conditions. So I tend to summarize these conditions as alignment, clarity, accountability, and competence. And for me, autonomy is something that works top down and bottom up. So I think alignment and clarity are very much things that fall within the leadership remit. Those are things that we need from leaders in order for autonomy to be successful. They need to set common goals. They need to point people in the right direction. If everyone's pulling in a different direction, we end up with chaos and we end up with anarchy. So we need clear direction. We also need clarity, we need context. If we're going to liberate teams to make their own decisions, we need to give them enough context that they can make good decisions that align with where the organization is going. So that's the leadership role. That's the top-down bit. The bottom-up bit is more around teams and individuals. And when it comes to teams and individuals, I think what makes autonomy work is accountability and competence. I think generally, the leadership side, the top-down side of autonomy is kind of quite well communicated. We obviously have to spend a lot of time convincing leaders to buy into autonomy. So likewise, we spend quite a lot of time telling them what they need to do to make it work. So I feel like there's already been a lot of talk about that. So what I want to focus on in this talk is more the bottom-up side of things. So I want to look at how we set up teams and individuals to better cope with autonomy. So I want to focus on these ideas of accountability and competence. So what are they? So accountability is about ownership. When we give people accountability, we're empowering them. We're literally giving them more power. With more power comes more responsibility. So anytime you have autonomy, you need accountability to go with it. If anyone's ever read the Netflix culture deck, they talk about freedom, but they talk about responsibility. They always talk about those things as a pair. If you have freedom without responsibility, that's when you start to get chaos. So that's one thing. Competence is the other thing. Again, if we're going to empower people and give them freedom to solve problems, we need to know they've got the right level of skills and the right level of experience. If you take a graduate engineer and ask them to build a hugely complex system at scale, despite their best efforts and best intentions, they're not necessarily going to do a very good job of it because they've not necessarily got the skills or experience to operate without any kind of guidance. Interesting, really interesting that Emma's just talked about Agile being thought of as on a scale, and that it's not are you agile or are you not agile, but how agile are you? It's an evolution, not a revolution. I would say exactly the same thing about autonomy. I think one of the problems with autonomy is that it tends to be oversimplified, that we come to think of it as something binary. We think of it as a light switch that we can either turn on or off. And in fact, I think we need to start thinking about it as operating on a scale. So one way to visualize this is with the favorite consultants quadrant. So on the horizontal, we've got autonomy. So low autonomy on one side and high autonomy on the other. And on the vertical, we've got accountability. So low accountability and high accountability. And essentially what we want is for the level of autonomy and the level of accountability to be relative to one another. So when the accountability is really high, the autonomy should be really high. If the accountability is low, the autonomy needs to be lower. And you can think about competence in exactly the same way. Got high levels of competence, then we can have high levels of autonomy. If we've got low levels of competence, then we actually need lower levels of autonomy. I didn't always think this way about things. I started off with a far more simplistic, far more black and white view about autonomy. So I want to share with you a couple of my experiences of working with different teams, which have helped me sort of evolve my current thinking. So early in my career, I worked with teams that I would place up in the top left-hand corner here. So we had teams that were highly competent, Very self-organizing, very skilled. They knew what to do, they knew how to do it, they knew how to do it fast. But they had quite low autonomy, and they were really frustrated by this, and I was frustrated for them. So this really kind of played into my feelings at the time that, you know, just switch on autonomy, let's just enable it. These guys can cope, they know what they're doing. And in reality, they absolutely could. But I'd actually taken for granted the levels of accountability and competence that made that possible. Later on in my career, I worked with teams that I would put in the bottom right-hand corner here. So I worked with an organization that was wholly committed to autonomy. It was a founding principle. But unfortunately, while they talked a lot about autonomy, they didn't talk a lot about accountability. So we had a lot of teams that had taken all the power and all the freedom, but hadn't taken the responsibility with it. What happens when you get high autonomy and low accountability? So we're not telling you what to do, but you're not figuring it out either. What happens in that situation is that the trust starts to be eroded. So leaders start to look at teams and think, well, we can't leave them to be autonomous because we can't trust them. What happens in that situation? Autonomy gets revoked. In this particular organization, that didn't happen. But that's always the risk. Leaders quite often need a lot of convincing to give autonomy a try. They are afraid of ceding control, and they genuinely believe that if they're not controlling everything, things will fall apart. So for them, it's a big risk to take. And if they don't see it working, the natural instinct is to start reducing it. Again, another organization I worked in, I saw low levels of competence. Again, high levels of autonomy, but we had teams and individuals that didn't necessarily have the skills or experience to do the job we were asking them to do. We had product owners we were expecting to function as product managers. So we'd hired them as product owners, and they'd got used to taking a bunch of requirements from the business and translating them into user stories and organizing a backlog and working with developers, and that was all fine. Once we started expecting them to be autonomous product managers, suddenly they needed strategic thinking, they needed commercial thinking, they needed to know how to do research, they needed to know how to do discovery, they needed to be able to prioritize opportunities. They needed to be able to run experiments. They needed to be able to test and learn. We were suddenly expecting them to do a whole bunch of stuff they hadn't done before. Likewise, we had a very junior engineering team. We were looking to build a system at huge scale. The kind of scale we were aiming for, no one on our engineering team had ever had experience of before. Again, if you give people a lot of autonomy and they don't necessarily have the skills and experience, they struggle to cope. And in this particular organization, whereas product and tech leadership were very committed to the principle of autonomy, the rest of the organization weren't so convinced. A lot of the rest of the leadership had come from really quite old-fashioned organizations, so they were very skeptical about autonomy. So what happens? We give these teams the autonomy, they start to struggle, the leadership starts to lose faith in the teams. And again, the instinct is, this autonomy thing, it just doesn't work. Yeah, it was a nice idea, but sorry, we were right all along. We just need to go back to telling everyone what to do. Again, happy ending to the story. We increased the competence of the organization. Instead, we started hiring in people with the skills and experience that we needed. So we didn't have to reduce the autonomy. Instead, we increased the competence. But in both of those last two organizations, that was possible because we had leadership that really believed in autonomy and knew that they had to make it work. Very often that isn't going to be the case. Very often when there is not a lot of confidence in the principle of autonomy right from the start, any sign that it's not working is going to be a good reason to revoke it. We have to build the trust. So if we're going to give teams autonomy, we have to make sure that they can be trusted. Otherwise, the autonomy gets revoked. The autonomy gets revoked, makes it much harder for us to really be agile. So I think it's much more helpful to start thinking about autonomy is something that operates on a scale. As Emma said, it's not a case of are you agile or are you not agile, it's a case of how agile are you. Same thing with autonomy. It's not a case of having autonomy or not having autonomy, it's having the right level of autonomy for where the team or the individual is at a given point in time. Depending on their level of accountability and their level of competence, adjust the autonomy so that it matches where the team are. I'm just going to briefly share a couple of coaching models that I think are really useful. They help bring this concept of autonomy operating on a scale to life. And I think they're also just a helpful reference point. If you're working with teams or individuals, it's a useful way to think about, okay, where are these guys now? And where's the next place that I need to get them to? The first model comes from David Marquet. Many of you may have read the book that he wrote, Turn the Ship Around. For anyone that's not come across David Marquet or his book, very brief introduction to him. So David Marquet was the captain of a nuclear submarine, a lifelong believer in autonomy, and he was really keen to change the working culture on the submarines he captained from one of what he described as being leader-follower to one which he called leader-leader. So he didn't believe he should be the only one doing all the thinking and making all the decisions and just telling everyone what to do. He thought that everybody should be playing a part in this. Interestingly, one of the things he describes in his book, his first attempt, he did literally just enable autonomy overnight, and it was absolute chaos. It was a complete disaster, so he had to revert it, and he just went back to telling everyone what to do. But he was committed to it, so he carried on, and ultimately he made a huge success of it. The submarine he captained went from being the worst in the US Navy to the best in the US Navy, so it was a big success story ultimately. And Marquet himself moved on to work as an executive coach and started to share a lot of his models and his thinking to help organizations improve. So one of these is the ladder of leadership. So you can see on the right hand side you've got the leader, and on the left hand side you've got the worker. At the bottom of the ladder, autonomy is very low. So the leader is literally just giving instructions, do this. As you start to move up, the leader is going, well, what do you think? So now you're getting the worker, as he calls it, start thinking about what we ought to do about this. Then it's, well, what do you recommend? What would you like to do? What do you intend to do? And so on. So the idea is this is a scale. You gradually progress up it. It doesn't matter where on the scale you start, so long as you're moving up it. A similar thing is the coaching continuum. So this was introduced to me by Lawrence Hayes, a really excellent head of talent and learning and development. Same thing, on the left-hand side, you've got push-style leadership. So that's where it's very directive. On the right-hand side, you've got the pull style. So at the far left, even further to the left, potentially than Marquet's, you're actually doing the work instead of them. Then you're telling them exactly what to do. Then you're advising, and then you move to suggesting, and then you're hinting, and then you're asking questions so they can start to figure it out for themselves. But again, it operates on a scale. And again, it doesn't matter where on the scale you start, so long as you're moving towards the right. The final model is Richard Watts's 3 stages of coaching. So he talks about coaching from the front, from the side, and from behind. So when you're coaching from the front, you're very much setting the direction. So the team hasn't necessarily got any kind of clarity on where they're going or what they're trying to achieve. So you're being quite prescriptive, you're providing quite a lot of direction. As they start to pick it up, you then move to coaching from the side. So that's when they're starting to think for themselves, and you're coaxing and hinting and making sure they're still going in the right direction. As they take more ownership and they have greater understanding, then you move to coaching from behind. So they're basically in charge. You're occasionally course correcting, maybe challenging some of their thinking, maybe encouraging them to be a little bit more ambitious. For me, this model I think is particularly helpful when it comes to agile coaching. And the reason I think that is that no matter how competent people are in their particular discipline, their level of agile competence could be quite low. So put simply, they don't necessarily know what good looks like. And the standout phrase for me in coaching from the front is that the team or individual doesn't yet have a frame of reference for where we're going. So they've maybe never tried anything agile before. They don't really know what this agile thing is all about. They don't know how to get started. So at that point in time, you do need to provide a bit more direction. You do need to be a little bit prescriptive. You need to get them up and running. The analogy that I use for this is that you don't teach people to swim by standing by the side of the pool and watching them drown. You need to figure out, when should I be in the pool and when is it safe to get out? I very often speak to both coaches and managers that see their teams drowning. They see their team struggling. They can see what's going wrong. They know why it's going wrong, but they're terrified of inhibiting the team's autonomy. They're terrified of compromising their autonomy. And so for that reason, they don't feel comfortable to step in. I think the problem with this is that ultimately that is hindering autonomy. It's not really helping it. That's when you're allowing chaos to carry on to thrive. And as long as chaos keeps going, the trust will be eroded and autonomy will eventually be revoked. Autonomy has a really, really high failure rate. So I think we need to think differently about it if we want to start making it more successful. I think the first thing we need to do is let's stop oversimplifying it. Let's stop treating it as a binary. It's not something that we can switch on. It's not something that will work overnight. It is much more of a transition, a transformation. It's something we've actually got to journey towards. So let's be open about that. Let's manage expectations. Let's be open about the fact that it's actually quite difficult to achieve and that we won't get there overnight, but we need to keep moving in the right direction. Let's start talking about it as operating on a scale. Let's talk about finding the right level of autonomy at the right time, rather than just saying we must have autonomy. Let's talk about what level of autonomy we should have, at what point. Emma talked about meeting an organization where it is. It's the same thing with autonomy. It's about meeting the team where it is. How much autonomy does this team need right now? How much are they ready for? And how do we get them to be ready for more? So I think we need to know when to coach from the front and when to coach from behind. We need to know when we should be supporting and when we should be challenging. And we need to know when we should be leading and when we should be serving. And that is it from me. So I will hand back to Alex.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Excellent talk. Okay, so some questions have come in. Emma, I'll go to you first, as Amanda has just spoken. Some organisations / contexts don't allow for adaptive delivery, government, regulatory services, etc. In such context, incremental, iterative is not necessarily a bad thing. What are your views on this?
That's right. I don't like it when people think of it as right or wrong. You don't have to be all the way to the right. It's about understanding what's best in the context that you're in, and to be as agile as you are able to be. And really that's about what it means to be agile, because it doesn't mean that you have to work in a very adaptive, quick cycle way. It's really, for me, being truly agile is about being collaborative and about responding to what the needs of the user actually is, and to deliver value as quick as you're able. And all of those things you're able to do in actually all of those different styles of delivery. And if you're constantly battling actually against the constraints of the organization that you're working in, no one's ever going to be happy and do their best work if all they're ever doing is fighting and getting frustrated. So sometimes you need to accept where you are and get the best out of it that you can, actually. And it might sound like a scary concept to some people, that you don't have to be all the way to the right to really be agile. But I think, yeah, sometimes you just have to work with what you've got. If you can't, I think it's worth noting that where I said to ask people, yeah, where is your organization and where do they want to be? But it applies to you personally as well. Because to say, if you're somebody who really wants to work in an adaptive way, and the constraints in the organization that you're in are never going to get past iterative, and maybe they won't, maybe that's the most they will ever manage, is to get to somewhere between incremental and iterative. If that's the reality of that organization, then actually maybe you're never going to be happy there, and maybe that's not the right place for you, because what you don't want to end up doing is getting frustrated and disengaged and disenfranchised, because that will just damage the overall culture as well, and you won't be happy. So what you actually probably need to do is find somewhere else where you can be happier.
Good answer, thank you. Next question is coming for both of you. So Amanda, I'll jump to you first, as Emma's just given us an answer. To Amanda then, what effects, and Emma, just jump in with your answer as soon as Amanda's finished with hers. What effects do you think more working from home will have on agile ways of working?
Interesting question. My personal view is I'm not a fan of it. I've always found that I've always gone to a lot of effort to make sure teams are co-located, because I think you collaborate better. It's the informal collaboration really you get when people are sat next to each other. And I think it's also that sense of getting to know people as people. People become human when you sit next to them and you chat to them about what you had for dinner last night or what you watched on TV. And I guess my fear is that we've proved that we can work from home, but I think it's not necessarily an optimal way to work. It's possible, not necessarily optimal. And my fear is that the bean counters and organizations will look at all the office rent they can save and go, great, everybody just work from home. And I know from my personal experience, I work freelance. I started a new role during lockdown. I find it immensely hard trying to do my job remotely, and I think I've suffered particularly because I've started remotely. But if I was looking at a future where this was the norm, I might seriously consider a different career. So yeah, personally, I'm not in favour of it. I think some level of flexible working is great, but I'm not sure the full remote situation is great.
I think it's right what you said, that it's you're able to do it, but it doesn't mean that it's optimal. I think the most complex team that I've had as far as remote working was, I'm not going to say how long ago because that made me sound really old, and I'm clearly much younger than I look. I had 2 people in Mumbai, 2 people in Pune, a couple of people in Bristol, a couple of people in London, a product owner in Australia, and 1 developer in Singapore. And that was a team, apparently, that I was given to try and help to work in a more agile way. And what we've found, though, and I've had every combination of completely remote and some in the office and a couple of people remote, and every combination you can think of over the years. And what I tend to find is that if everyone's remote, that's fine. If everyone in the office is together, then that's fine. But where you've got a hybrid, where there's some people in the office and some people remote, that's when the culture can start to erode, and the collaboration can erode. And like you say, Amanda, getting to know people as people can really suffer. My concern with the difference in lockdown is that I think when it first hit and it was like, right, everybody go home, everyone was really purposeful in their organizations and in their teams around, okay, we're going to make sure that the comms stay good and the culture stays good, and everything was very directed at, right, now we're suddenly in this new world, how do we make this work? And everybody has actually made it work. Like you say, it might not be optimal, but it's functional, and people are able to do that. My real concern is for when we start to dial back out of that. And there are already some people in offices a couple of days a week. I have no intention of going back to the office in a hurry, if ever, to be perfectly honest. I was saying to a couple of people before, I have a very long commute and I am not going to do that again. But already I'm getting that pang of FOMO of, okay, there's some people in the office. What am I missing? What are conversations around the printer or the whiteboard that I'm missing out on? And it's that if we don't go into that hybrid and that dial out of it as purposefully as we went into this remote working, then I think that's when we're going to start to find cultural dysfunction seeping into the teams and the organizations, because it's a very different thing. All together is great, all remote is workable. Bit of both and not really doing it mindfully, that's when we're going to start to run into more cultural problems. That's my real concern, is dialing back out of it.
Great answers. Thank you. Okay, so question to Amanda. On the second to last slide, there was a statement of autonomy has a high failure rate. What research or data is there to back this?
That's a fair point. I don't think there is any data. It's partly off personal observation, partly listening to colleagues in the industry, partly talking and listening to leaders of organizations. I think it's also, if you wanted to get quantitative data around it, I think it would be quite hard to measure, because again, it's operating on a scale. So what does, how do you judge how autonomous you really are?
Perfect. Okay, a question to Emma. You might have touched on this, actually. Some organizations, sorry, I've covered that one, apologies. What advice would you give when dealing with people who are reluctant to adapt? You might have touched on this a little bit earlier, Emma, but it's come in from another person. So what advice would you give when dealing with people who are reluctant to adapt?
I think it's not specific to the delivery styles conversation, and I think Amanda's probably got something to add on it as well, as far as getting people to adapt to the way that they do autonomy as well. But I think if there's anybody that you're trying to deal with that you want them to work differently or to behave differently than you're getting right now, you really have to understand why they think that way, or why they're working that way, or where that's coming from, I have the same conversations with my 10-year-old right now about trying to understand her friendships, and it drives her nuts that my as soon as she starts complaining about one of her friends, my go-to question to her is, well, why do you think that they're doing that? Or she's complaining because daddy won't let her walk across the field on her own to Nana's. It's like, well, why do you think that daddy has such a problem with you walking across the field? And how does daddy feel? And not just what is he thinking, but what is he feeling when he says that to you? I think whenever you're asking someone to change something, you have to start by understanding them, which it's a whole other subject. It's probably a whole talk in its own right about there's a lot of talk about empathy. Now, I don't particularly like empathy creeping in. I think it's an overused term, and it's one that's misunderstood. People will say it's important to feel empathy and to express empathy with people that you're working with, and that's how you'll bring them on side. Empathy literally means to feel what that person is feeling, which I don't think is useful to you if you're trying to move somebody away from that feeling. But what you can do is start with understanding and compassion about understanding why they're feeling the way that they are, and then actually trying to use that argument and to shift them from that perspective. It's usually people are frightened of moving to something, or they need to move towards something rather than away from something. So you've got to understand their motivations. And I don't think there's a one answer to it, but it starts with understanding. Amanda, is there anything else you would add to that? It's probably as relevant for autonomy as it is for any way of working.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. And I think certainly when I was working with teams where there was this accountability issue, accountability was really low. That's exactly where I started, was trying to figure out why. And actually, one of the conclusions I got to was that expectations were really unclear. So, people weren't necessarily, and, I don't think anybody sets out to be irresponsible. So when you're seeing those kind of problems, the first step is understanding why they're happening, because people aren't necessarily going to realize that they're happening. This is not malicious or willful. So yes, I think starting with, well, why is this happening is useful in just about any context.
Thank you. Emma, how many organizations have you coached who are practicing scaled agile, where adaptive learning is at program level? Would you describe this as iterative?
Thinking scaled, probably 7 or 8. Big scale, as in thousands of people, big, with like dozens and dozens of teams, that kind of scale. Yeah, probably 7 or 8 at that kind of scale. And of those that are actually working iterative, what I tended to find in probably the most successful teams, and I find it really interesting. I had to stifle a giggle when you were talking, Amanda, about autonomy but directionless autonomy. We have one client particularly that we're trying to work in a very scaled way, and our comment in our organization was that they were going for autonomy and ended up with chaos, because it was literally that they didn't know what they were doing. That was just hey, you're autonomous, off you go, and then nothing actually got done, and that soon got scaled back, and we see that too. In that case, to the most successful of them, even though they're big scaled environments, the teams themselves are still, because they're working quite autonomous, I would still, they're still iterative, or they're still iterative, bordering on adaptive in those kinds of, when they can scale down their operation, even though they're part of a very large organization. Genuinely, the bigger they are, the further to the left they tend to be. I haven't seen many that break out of incremental, particularly in a scaled program of work. So if it's one product that they're trying to work on and the work has been broken out into lots of teams, then genuinely they tend to at least start, when they engage with us, in that in at least incremental, maybe sequential, and we try and move them to more of an iterative so they can at least get some learning out of it. But I haven't seen any of them move successfully to truly adaptive.
Thank you. Questions come in to you both. So Amanda, we'll go to you first. Emma, jump straight in with your answer after. How can Agile/Lean principles be embedded in the construction industry?
Oh boy, not having a huge amount of knowledge of the construction industry, I'm not sure that I'd have an answer for this off the top of my head. But I guess with Lean and Agile, it's always about going back to the key principles and then figuring out, well, how do you apply those in a particular context? So I tend to think of it as being better, faster, and happier. And those areas, you can look at quite separately. Happier is really around, how do you get the the best out of your team. So part of that is the autonomy piece and the development piece. How do you empower people more and therefore get more from them? How do you leverage the collective ability of your organization better? When it comes to better, I don't think anyone's really exempt from being able to do that, really, because creating better products and services applies to any organization, and better products and services comes from a really good understanding of what it is that what your customers' problems are, what is it you're actually achieving for them. There's actually a brilliant article on the Harvard Business Review about jobs to be done, which, if you've not come across it before, is a sort of discovery method. And it's really about getting down to the heart of what it is the customer's trying to achieve. And the case study they used actually did apply to, I don't know if you directly call it the construction industry, but the example they used was a company that was building condos in the United States. And trying to figure out how they needed to build them in order that people were going to buy them. So, they did what we typically do in technical product development. They started talking to customers, but they didn't just sort of go, what do you want? They really tried to understand what was important to the customer. So they weren't asking customers to prescribe the solution, but really just try and deeply understand the customer problems. So I think in terms of getting better, you could certainly do that. In terms of speed, I don't really know enough about the process of construction, and obviously there's a lot less room to go back. A big principle of lean is leaving decisions until the last responsible moment. There's probably a degree to which you could apply that in construction, but obviously there's there's going to be definitely a point of no return much sooner in construction. So there's probably less ability to adapt, I would guess. Emma, I don't know if you can shed a bit more light.
I immediately smile when you say construction. So literally renovated our house using Kanban. And I have plans for a self-build right now. And I keep telling my husband, like, oh no, we're just going to do it straw bale, and I'll just build the bits that we want. And then as we want more rooms, we'll just build more rooms onto it. So I'm completely going that way of working. No, I think it's probably a bit flippant. But the thing that I really come back to especially when I'm working with teams around their motivation and the culture and trying to get the best out of people is the Dan Pink stuff around drive, around mastery, autonomy, purpose, and those things apply no matter what industry actually you're working in. As far as the more practical and the ways of working, just the delivery styles that I talked about before, realistically in a construction industry, I think there tends to be an assumption that, well, we're working in construction, so it has to be sequential because it takes so much planning and it takes so much coordination of all those bits that it has to be sequential. But actually you could probably work in more of that incremental, iterative, focus on one thing, do it really well, move on to the next. You can trust in your teams because they are the ones that really have the skills. You can allow them to get to the best of it and build really collaborative teams as they go. But you can do it incrementally. You could even work towards an iterative thing, but I think you're never going to escape the fact that actually there's so much regulatory stuff and that has to go on in the construction industry. You're never going to start building a bungalow and then change your mind halfway through and go and build an office block because that's what people really need. So it's never going to be that adaptive, but there's certainly a lot of the principles and the practices that you can take from it. My husband hates it when I put a Kanban on the wall of all the jobs that we need in the house, but yeah.
You can't have everything your own way.
He says I'm managing him. Oh.
Yeah. Great talks from, thank you, Amanda and Emma. And this isn't my closing statement. This is a leading on to a question from somebody. So great talks. Thank you very much, Amanda and Emma. I love the point about avoiding snobbery of a binary agile or not agile. Linked to a previous question, can a small team within a large organization adopt agile as a pilot, or will there be too many barriers due to the overall functioning and culture of the larger organisation? That was a question to you both. Emma, as you've just answered, we'll jump straight back to Amanda and then jump straight in with your answer straight after. Amanda?
I would say yes, absolutely, definitely. Starting small is always a really good way to go. Yes, there might be some constraints. There might be a limit to how far you can go with it. But I would say that I've certainly worked with teams that are embedded in not particularly agile organizations, in fact, very unagile organizations, and they've still managed to make a fair bit of progress with it. So yes, I think you can certainly do it. And actually, starting small is a great way to go. proving the concept in one team and being able to demonstrate that you're doing something differently and that what you're doing differently is actually working better is a great way to get support. It's actually much better to start smaller than it is to try and do the kind of big bang approach where everyone changes at the same time.
Yep. I think the other thing I would add to that, and something I've generally work, I think it's true of most organizations actually. There's usually, even in an organization that is very agile and very far to the right on that scale, there's always teams that are working at different paces and are at different levels of maturity and different ways of working even within those organizations. One of the things that I tend to do quite regularly with teams, and I would encourage you to all do it yourselves, perhaps in retrospectives, is when we talk in retrospectives and we look at the things that are really driving frustration, where are our real pain points in this team? What are we struggling with to make happen? One of the things I do is draw that target. Probably seen it a lot before, which is right in the center we put all the things that we can control. What are the things that are actually within this team's control? And on the next level out is what are the things that you can influence? And then the next level out is what's the stuff that you just have to respond to? And the idea is to try and get as much as you can inside your control, and acknowledge and be really eyes open about the stuff that you absolutely can't, but what you have to do is protect yourselves from. And what that does is to help you draw out the size of your bubble. I talked about that bubble, that sphere of influence that you have within the organization. And when you are starting off and you are trying to, okay, we're going to do things differently, we're going to be as agile as we can, and the rest of the organization maybe aren't and maybe never will be, but we're going to do what we can. It really helps for you to understand what is that sphere, how big is my bubble in this organization, what's the sphere of influence. And when you then try and grow that out and try and change things, what you're doing is just pushing on the edges of that bubble and trying to make more of those things come under your control, or the stuff that you just have to respond to. Well, how can you influence that? And then what you find is that your bubble starts to grow and the organization comes along with you.
Thank you very much. And that brings us to the end of the questions for this evening. Massive thank you to Amanda and Emma for your great talks and your contributions to Agile London and the Agile community on a whole. These events wouldn't run, I mean, Oliver Bernard is the agency I work for. My name's Alex Scriven, but these events wouldn't run, we're happy to sort of provide the platform, but they wouldn't run without great speakers sort of putting their name forward to deliver a talk. And they also wouldn't be, they wouldn't be as great without all you sort of lovely members of our audience. So thank you very much to everyone. We're back next Wednesday. We've got Tim Robinson, Scott Seabright and Ian McLaren Wallace talking next Wednesday. Additionally, I did send a mail to our Agile London meetup group with a very, very short survey, which will take you less than 5 minutes to complete. It's about the effects of COVID-19 on the tech industry, and we're utilising our pretty big network to just get a general feel of how we feel things might be affected, and we're going to publish the results as well. So I'd really appreciate it if you all could just jump on that and complete the survey for me. This is recorded and will be on our YouTube channel within the next 24 hours. It's usually done by 10 a.m. tomorrow morning. So keep an eye on that. Please share it and watch it again, and all the slides and visuals will be on there. The recruitment market is quiet at the moment, I'm not going to lie, but if you are looking for work, do reach out. As I say, my name's not Oliver Bernard, that's just the name of the login that I use. My name's Alex Scriven. You will find me on LinkedIn easily. We will do our very best to help you find something new, and if anything does come live, at least you'll be on our radar, and we'll get visibility of your profile pretty quickly. If you are hiring as well, do reach out to me. I've got some great people looking for work. Thank you once again, Amanda. Thank you again, Emma. Fantastic talks tonight. Really appreciate it. Have a lovely evening, everyone, and I hope to see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.